Mackenzie! Mackenzie! Where the hell is he? Ah, Sergeant. Where the hell have you been then? What the hell are you wearing? I don't really know, Sergeant, but all my kit's gone. What do you mean it's all gone? All of it. That's all you have left? Well, I heard some commotion about my bed space last night, and when I woke up this morning, it was just all of it gone. This is all I have. This, whatever this is, that's all you're wearing then. Just that. Yes, this is all I'm wearing, yes. He left me with this. Stop. Don't even think about bending over. I'll get it.
Dear Private Mackenzie, thank you so much for lending me your kit. Don't worry, it's still inside the Empire over in Canada. Rest assured that it will be returned promptly after the project is complete. I'm making a video about kit, and yours will fit the bill beautifully. I know that you must be at a loss as to what to wear, so I have left you this smashing t-shirt. I know you'll love it. Take care and caberfade. Rob from British Muzzleloaders.
Canada? He took all your kit to Canada? Who is this Rob fellow anyway? Never mind. What's this about making a video? What's a video?
When I started the channel, I had no intent of making it what it's become today. A little bit of shooting, exploring the characteristics of Victorian arms and maybe a bit of their history was all that I really had in mind. Quite early on, it occurred to me that the jeans and t-shirt approach probably wouldn't be quite as appropriate as it could be for what I was trying to achieve with the channel. And the addition of a hat or maybe a quasi-period uniform might lend itself to better explaining the context of the firearms I was discussing. It started with a hat. This is my Kilmarnock bonnet. This was the undress headdress of most Scottish units during the 1840s, 50s, and into the 1860s. And it was the first piece of kit that I acquired to do, as I mentioned, add a little bit of color. As the focus of the channel initially was on the Enfield family of muzzle-loading rifles, I thought it pertinent to use this style of cap because it came from the same era. From this cap has grown a collection of uniforms and kit to better demonstrate and explain the context of the rifles showcased on the channel. In this series of videos, I'll answer the most often asked question on the channel. Where did you get your kit? Uniforms of the British and Empire armies is a gargantuan topic. Books, documentaries, manuals, and pamphlets are prolific. The intent here is not to deal with the subject as a whole, but rather the small slice I have chosen to represent in order to accompany the rifles showcased on the channel. As it regards the clothing I have for use on the channel, it might be divided into two categories. One, a generic though somewhat historical collection, and two, those items that make up the various Highland representations seen in various videos. We'll deal with the generic items first. As mentioned in the beginning, it was a cap which started me down the path of the channel now follows. This was my Kilmarnock bonnet. Mine is representative of the style worn by Highland regiments in the 1850s and 60s. Its name was derived from its place of manufacture, Kilmarnock in Scotland, a town known for its woolen industry. Indeed, the whole of the infantry wore a variation of this cap, with the line infantry wearing a plain blue one, the light infantry and rifles a green one, and most Scottish regiments a diced version. In Highland regiments, it was officially replaced in the 1850s by the Glengarry, which at the time was simply a reshaped Kilmarnock, but the round version was still being worn into the 1860s. This example, worn by the 93rd Highlanders on campaign in 1863, having been readopted after the regiment had been exclusively equipped with a Glengarry as far back as the Crimean War in 1854. My Kilmarnock is knitted and fulled in the traditional way by Sally Pointer, who handcrafts historical woolen hats in Wales. Her product is superior. The numerals, a feature on most Kilmarnocks in most regiments, were made by me from brass stock. They are, however, slightly oversized. For hotter work, I've used a white cover I made from an old bed sheet, which generally follows the kind of cover used in hot weather. Replacing the Kilmarnock in Highland regiments officially in the 1850s, and in the infantry as a whole in the 1870s, was the Glengarry. Beginning as a Kilmarnock folded flat, it evolved into a standalone design with stiffening manufactured into its sides, giving its distinctive wedge-like shape when worn. Badged on the left front, it had two tails, which were the decorative vestiges of tapes used to tighten the bonnet about the head. Mine is an old and rather battered example, with the other ranks version of the Seaforth Highlanders cap badge. Modern examples are available across the internet and from any Highland outfitter. Beware of cheaper quality versions, however. I have another Kilmarnock that was purchased for a project that never materialized. It is green, in the rifles and light infantry tradition, and it has somewhat lower proportions as commonly found in the late 1860s. The badge is a fairly generic representation of a light infantry bugle, and was chosen by consensus as best to represent that which may have been worn by the York Rifle Company, which served in the 1866 Fenian raids into what is now Ontario. If the Kilmarnock was the undress or forage cap of the infantry, or Highland units in particular, then the feather bonnet was the full dress item. The bonnet grew from the woolen round bonnet which had feathers attached to hang over the crown that was used during the Napoleonic Wars. Interestingly, the bonnet was essentially made as the Kilmarnock would be later. By the 1820s, the bonnet had lost its woolen crown, which was replaced by a wire or wicker frame. This, covered in light fabric, was itself covered in black ostrich plumes, with a number hanging down on the right-hand side. The bonnet was hollow, and was complemented with a large feather plume known as a hackle, which was white for all Highland regiments except the Black Watch, who wore red. This pattern of headdress has remained unchanged to this day, and remains one of the hallmarks of Highland full dress. The feather bonnet was last worn on campaign during the Indian Mutiny. The 79th, the 92nd, and the 93rd were recorded as wearing theirs. Mine is an antique, and although used, is still in great condition. Although campaigning in the feather bonnet ended with the mutiny, it was still worn, as indeed all full-dress headdress of the army, on manoeuvres, on home service, until the very late 1890s. Coming into service at the last stage of the Indian Mutiny, the cork or wicker helmet became an archetypal symbol of the British Army on foreign service. Properly termed the Foreign Service helmet, rather than pith helmet or safari hat, they were at times throughout the era covered, decorated, or augmented with various additions. Famously in South Africa during the Zulu Wars, they were stained brown from their initial white and were without any other augmentation. For service in Egypt in 1882, they were commonly wrapped with a puggree. This long, thin strip of cloth had its origins as a scarf that could be soaked for a cooling effect, or used as a sunshade or mosquito net. By the 1880s, it had evolved into a decorative addition, with many formalized folds giving a uniform look. Eventually, these would at times be themselves augmented with colored strips, woven or folded into their layers as a way to identify its wearer's unit or rank. Admittedly, mine is a cheap example from a local surplus store. Although not particularly historical, I modified the contour of the peak to be more rounded and flatter to the forehead. I added a puggree with a tartan patch, badge, and white hackle, as worn by the Seaforth Highlanders for their participation in the reconquest of the Sudan in 1898. There are a great many examples out there, and can range in price. Sadly, most are offshore knockoffs with poor quality internal components and the wrong shape. I, at the time of this video, have the fortunate use of a borrowed and magnificent bearskin cap. The bearskin was used from the mid-18th century as a dress distinction of the grenadiers of a battalion. Fusiliers took to wearing them in the 18th century too. But the bearskin as a mark of the Guards can be traced to the post-Waterloo era, whereby the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards who had defeated the French Guard at the climax of the battle were renamed the Grenadier Guards. In keeping with their new name, the appropriate headdress was adopted for all ranks, not just the Grenadier Company. Shortly after, all Guards regiment took to wearing this cap. and thus an inseparable association was born. Bearskins were last worn on campaign during the Crimean War, featuring prominently at the Elma and to a certain extent Inkerman. Mine is actually an officer's pattern, with its softer female hair and greater height. From what I can deduce, it originated from the Governor General's Foot Guards in Canada sometime in the 1960s. For me, it is more than adequate, and it is a privilege to have the use of it. I have done my best to link it to the Grenadier Guards. Harry, a friend of the channel, generously donated a Grenadier's white plume and valise plate that will do to replicate the ornament worn on the ammunition pouch worn by this regiment. All of this is for an intended upcoming project. Thanks very much, Harry. So that outlines the headdress I use for various purposes. There are quite a few, but they all get used to some degree and lend a bit of colour to the somewhat lesser historical projects. For footwear, I use a pair of boots for general purposes. They are representative, though not wholly accurate, of the kind of boots worn in the late Victorian era. They are leather, with leather soles, reinforced with typical metal fittings at the heel, toe, and forefoot. They are nothing special, although they have one feature that makes them more appropriate for the Victorian era in that they lack a toe cap. They came to me second-hand, although originally my understanding is that they came from a company known as What Price Glory in the United States. In looking at their site, it appears as though they are reasonably priced. To go along with the boots, from the 1870s, leather leggings were issued and used until the early 1900s. Perhaps most famously seen in the movie Zulu, my pair were made by me, using relatively soft leather with brass eyelets and laces. They are not perhaps exactly historical, but are fairly close and represent the historical rather well. Measurements are thus. For most general outings, I rely overwhelmingly on a bush jacket. Hard-wearing and durable, it is a Canadian pattern that dates from the 1960s. Indeed, the forerunner of the combat uniform that is, although made in a camouflage material today, just being replaced at the time of this video. My example was acquired from a local surplus shop many years ago, although they do come up from time to time on the internet. For cooler weather, I have taken to wearing a pair of woolen trousers. They are current Guards issue and are essentially unchanged from the Victorian times, save some modern materials used in the lining and pockets. They come up high over the waist, and the rear is raised in a swallowtail, universal during the era for protection of the kidneys and warmth. Quality is excellent, and have proven to be hard-wearing. The fact that they are today a purely ceremonial item is somewhat of a paradox, as they of course were intended to be worn in the field during the Victorian era. My braces are a bit of a cheat. Period examples were of linen or cotton and didn't stretch, blowing buttons and tearing seats regularly. Mine are heavy elastic, and they look the part, while not placing one's dignity at risk. They are from Soldier of Fortune in the UK. For cold weather shooting, as well as for historical purposes, I acquired a Greatcoat. Made of heavy grey wool, it is a pattern used by the Guards for public duties in the winter months. It has been modified by a couple of changes. The shoulder reinforcing patches have been removed, not a feature of Victorian greatcoats, and a pair of capes have been made to represent army greatcoats from the 1800s. Early in the era, the greatcoat included a fairly shallow cape over the shoulders that was, to my understanding, permanently fixed. This pattern was perhaps most apparent during the Crimean War, with numerous photographs showing it. At some point later on, perhaps into the 1860s or 70s, the cape was made removable and lengthened. A version of this, too, I have made. This style of cape was an integral part of the man's kit, being mentioned separately in clothing instructions and kit lists. The cape was detachable and served for extra protection in particularly inclement weather. To fashion both of these, I used as a base a modern cape as used by the Guards Division in bad weather in summertime. The modern version is intended to be a standalone garment, and as such it has grown in length to cover the hands. The Victorian cape was much shorter, indeed the placement of rank badges on greatcoats low on the sleeve being due to facilitate their visibility from below the cape's hem. In cutting down the modern cape to Victorian dimensions, I was left with a wide strip of material, which, when deep darts were sewn into it, gave a decent representation of the Crimean pattern of cape, albeit detachable. So, with the combination of coat, short cape, and long cape, Any part of the Victorian era can be duly represented. I have a number of shirts for wear on their own or under frocks or tunics and doublets. The 1860s saw the last use of a style of shirt that was very loose-fitting and gathered at the cuffs. They were typically white or natural color, and I used versions found at American Civil War dealers as representative of what could have been typical. From the 1870s, a new style of shirt was issued. This would become famously known as the greyback, for obvious reasons. Mine was a gift from Stan at the regimental quartermaster. The quality is excellent, and I recommend them to anyone who's interested. I have one more shirt that is too a gift. A friend of the channel, Mark, made this brown cotton example by hand, and is representative of a civilian shirt of the 1860s. The pattern is associated with the American Civil War, although one might do to link it as well to a man of the Canadian militia, who may have had to supply his own undergarments. Fine work indeed. So that brings us to the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll cover the items that make up the various Highland pattern uniforms seen on the channel. I'd like to say a special thank you to a couple of people. Eric, Chad, and Kevin from Iraq Veteran 8888. Kevin in particular had fired me an email and asked me if I would like one of their t-shirts. Rather fitting for the channel, don't you think? It's a fantastic t-shirt, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below.